Welcome to the debate. Today we're tackling one of the most maddening experiences in the human brain.
Oh, absolutely maddening.
Right? So picture this. You're watching an English movie, you understand every single joke, every nuance, the grammatical structure makes perfect sense, but the second you open your mouth to order a coffee or respond to a basic question, your brain just completely flatlines.
Yeah, it's like the bridge between your brain and your mouth just evaporates.
Exactly. Nothing comes out. Why does that happen?
It's universally shared and honestly, deeply frustrating. You've got the vocabulary locked in your head, you understand the syntax, yet you freeze. I mean, it is the ultimate ESL speaking problem.
It really is. It's the classic gap between passive understanding and active speaking. And today, we're framing our discussion around a fundamental question that emerges from the literature on language acquisition.
Right. Getting to the root of why I can't speak English when I clearly know it.
Exactly. So the question is this inability to speak primarily a neurological, habit-based mismatch, where we simply train our brains for input rather than output? Or conversely, is it primarily a psychological barrier?
Yeah, is it a deeply rooted fear loop, like a habit of overthinking that actively paralyzes speech, rendering all of that passive knowledge completely inaccessible when you actually need it?
Well, I'll be arguing that this gap is fundamentally a mechanical and neurological mismatch. Learners just train input rather than output, leaving them without the physical cognitive pathways required for speech.
And I'll be arguing that the root of the problem is a psychological block, specifically a fear loop that actively paralyzes speech and prevents that output from happening in the first place.
Okay, let's get right into the mechanics of how we learn. Because the fundamental premise I'm operating from is that the inability to speak is a cognitive and habit-based failure.
A mechanical failure.
Right. There's a profound difference between passive and active knowledge. As the source material correctly identifies, understanding is recognition, whereas speaking is production.
Which are two incredibly different brain functions.
Completely different. I mean, when you're watching a video or listening to a podcast, your brain is engaged in pattern recognition. The speaker in the video is doing all the heavy lifting.
Yeah, they're the ones fetching the words.
Exactly. They are retrieving the vocabulary, conjugating the verbs, structuring the sentence. Your brain merely has to recognize those patterns and assign meaning to them.
Sure.
And learners erroneously believe that this recognition automatically translates into the ability to produce. But neurologically, if you spend 3 hours a day training listening, you've trained your input mechanisms perfectly. But you have zero training in output.
Zero, yeah.
You literally haven't built the neural pathways required to spontaneously retrieve a word, format it into a sentence, and physically articulate it. It's entirely a mechanical failure of practice. You're training input, not output.
I completely agree that understanding is recognition and speaking is production. We're on the same page there. But I come at it from a different way when we look at why that production fails.
Okay.
The mechanical lack of practice isn't the root cause here. It's merely a symptom of a deeper psychological avoidance. The fundamental barrier is psychological.
How so? I mean, if the pathway isn't there, it isn't there.
Because the brain actively blocks output because it fears making mistakes. When a learner is put on the spot, the brain doesn't simply fail to find a neural pathway. It perceives a social threat.
A threat?
Yes, it enters a state of anxiety, what we can call a fear loop. This anxiety consumes cognitive load. The working memory that should be used to retrieve vocabulary is instead hijacked by the fear of sounding foolish, the fear of judgment, and, a hyperfixation on perfection. This habit of overthinking is what ultimately paralyzes the learner. So yes, there is an input-output mismatch, but that mismatch exists because the psychological fear of output keeps the learner safely confined to the comfortable realm of input.
Okay, you're right about the anxiety-consuming cognitive load. That's a real phenomenon. But I think you're misreading why it happens. To me, it puts the cart before the horse.
How do you figure?
Well, isn't the fear of mistakes simply a natural byproduct of knowing you haven't mechanically trained for production? Think about a musician.
Hold on, let me stop you right there, because I know where you're going with the musician analogy, and it just falls short.
Let me finish the thought.
No, but a language learner isn't standing on a stage performing a complex Beethoven sonata. They're usually just trying to ask for directions or order a coffee. These are basic, functional interactions utilizing vocabulary they absolutely already possess.
But it is a performance. Even basic interactions require real-time neural mapping.
Ordering a latte is a performance?
Yes, synchronous speech is a performance. If a musician never practices playing a difficult piece, they will absolutely experience anxiety before performing it. But the root cause of their failure on stage isn't the fear itself. It's the fundamental lack of mechanical practice.
Okay, I see the logic.
The fear is a perfectly rational response to their lack of preparation. When language learners freeze, it isn't because an irrational fear loop is blocking fully formed abilities. It's because their brain does a quick inventory and realizes, we have never actually built the cognitive machinery to construct this sentence in real time.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that it's merely an inventory check.
Why not?
Because if your theory held true, a learner sitting completely alone in their bedroom should have no problem speaking out loud. There's no audience. There's no social threat, yet we see the exact same paralysis.
Do we, though?
Yes, even when alone, learners struggle to produce spoken language because the internalized standard of perfection remains. The fear loop is insidious. It isn't just a fear of public embarrassment. It's an internal intolerance for being messy, for sounding like a child when you know you have the intellect of an adult.
Okay, that is a very real frustration for adults.
Right. The brain shuts down production to avoid the cognitive dissonance of knowing what perfect English sounds like passively, but producing flawed English actively. The avoidance is active, not passive.
That's a really compelling description of the emotional experience. I'll give you that. Adults are terrified of sounding stupid, but if we assume you're right and this is an emotional shield, let's look at the actual mechanics of failure in the moment.
Sure. Let's look at the moment of panic.
When a learner tries to speak and fails, what are they actually doing?
They're freezing. They go blank.
No, they aren't just freezing. They're translating. They hear an English prompt, they process it, they formulate a complex response in their native language, and then they try to manually translate that response word for word back into English.
Well, yes, translation happens.
And the reason they fail to speak fluently is because this translation process takes far too much time and cognitive energy. I argue that learners translate instead of expressing because they haven't built the mechanical habit to actually think in English.
You're saying translation is just a default mechanism.
Exactly. Translating isn't an emotional defense mechanism. It's simply the brain relying on the only neurological pathway it currently has.
See, I interpret that translation process entirely differently. To me, translation is the ultimate symptom of overthinking, and overthinking is a psychological shield.
A shield against what?
Against sounding incompetent. Why does the learner formulate the thought in their native language first?
Because it's easier. It's the paved road.
Because they want to guarantee that the underlying thought is sophisticated and perfectly constructed before they risk vocalizing it. It's a vetting process. They're acting as their own harsh editor, pausing the output to verify accuracy via the native language.
But that's just a habit.
It's a habit born of fear. If they were to bypass translation and simply express themselves directly in the target language, they'd have to accept that their expression would be rudimentary. They'd have to use simple words and fragmented grammar. It's driven by the fear of being misunderstood or appearing unintelligent, not merely a lack of mapped pathways.
I see why you think that. But honestly, you're attributing incredibly complex psychological motives to what is essentially a path of least resistance cognitive function.
You think I'm overcomplicating it?
A bit, yeah. The brain is highly efficient. When faced with a task of expressing a complex thought, it will automatically default to the strongest, most heavily myelinated neural pathways available.
Okay, for our listeners who aren't neuroscientists, break down myelinated in this context.
Right, so myelin is basically the insulation around our nerves that allows signals to travel quickly. The more you use a pathway, the more myelinated it gets. For the learner, their native language is a heavily myelinated superhighway.
And spoken English?
Spoken English is an unpaved trail in the woods.
The brain isn't translating out of a fear of looking foolish. It's translating because the unpaved trail simply cannot handle the traffic of a complex thought yet.
So it reroutes to the native language.
Exactly. When the source material says that learners train listening and not speaking, it points to a very specific structural deficit. If you haven't systematically practiced outputting direct thoughts in English, the brain has no choice but to route the thought through the native language. It's a routing issue.
But the routing issue doesn't explain the physical tension, the hesitation, and the active suppression of words that actually do pop into the learner's head.
What do you mean by active suppression?
Often, a learner will instinctively think of the correct English word, like it flashes in their mind, but they will stop themselves from saying it. They run it through a mental grammar check. Is it in the table or on the table? Did I use the past participle correctly?
They're verifying. That's a normal part of learning.
They're overthinking. By the time they've vetted the word, the conversation has moved on, and they remain silent. That hesitation isn't a lack of a neural pathway. The word was right there. The pathway fired.
But it fired too slowly.
No. The fear loop intercepted the signal before it could reach the vocal cords. The overthinking overrides the mechanical retrieval. This is exactly why you have students, especially like IELTS for TOEFL students, who can write beautifully in English, composing gorgeous essays, but who absolutely cannot speak.
Well, writing is different.
But they have the pathways for output. Writing allows them the time to satisfy their perfectionism. Speaking demands a vulnerability they're psychologically unwilling to tolerate.
Okay, that brings up a fascinating distinction, and I want to pause on it because it's crucial. Synchronous versus asynchronous retrieval.
Oh, I love that framing. Synchronous versus asynchronous. Let's unpack that.
It is the defining difference. Writing is an asynchronous mechanical process. It allows for asynchronous retrieval. You can pause, you can search your memory, you can delete, you can rewrite.
Sure, you have all the time in the world.
Right. But speaking requires synchronous, real-time retrieval and motor execution. You have to retrieve the word and fire the vocal cords simultaneously. It's a completely different athletic event for the brain. So the fact that they can write but not speak doesn't prove it's a psychological block. It proves they haven't trained for the synchronous real-time event.
But if we assume you're right, how does that change the way a learner should actually fix the problem tomorrow morning?
It changes everything about the solution.
Right. So if writing is asynchronous and speaking is synchronous, how do they bridge that gap?
By addressing the mechanics directly. The material points toward very clear mechanical solutions. Speak daily, even alone, and think in English. These are directives to build the necessary daily output training.
Just brute force it?
Yes, you have to correct the input-output imbalance through sheer volume. If a learner forces themselves to output English for 20 minutes a day, regardless of their emotional state, they will eventually build the pathways required for real-time expression. The solution is systematic output to mirror the systematic input they've already consumed.
And yet, notice the specific qualitative advice the material provides alongside those daily habits.
What do you mean?
It emphasizes using imperfect sentences, embracing messy repetition, and recognizing that progress over perfection is the key. Why? Because simply telling an anxious learner to speak daily is like telling someone with a phobia of water to just go swim daily.
Come on, I wouldn't call it a phobia.
It acts like one in the brain. The psychological remedies are the actual catalyst for change here. The only way to bridge the gap is to break the fear loop. Messy repetition isn't just a mechanical exercise, it's an emotional release.
An emotional release?
Yes. It's a psychological reframing that gives the learner permission to drop the shield of perfectionism. Without that psychological shift, a learner will simply sit in their room for those 20 minutes, silently overthinking and translating in their head, completely unable to perform the mechanical output you're asking for.
Well, that's a fair point about them sitting silently. I can see that happens. But I would frame messy repetition differently.
How so?
It isn't just about feeling okay with mistakes or achieving some sort of zen emotional release. It is a necessary mechanical stepping stone. You must produce imperfect sentences simply to get the physical and neurological repetitions required for fluency. Think of a baby learning to walk.
Okay.
They don't fall down because they have a psychological fear of walking. They fall down because their muscles and balance are undeveloped. Their messy repetition of stumbling is how the brain calibrates motor control.
Right, but an adult isn't a baby.
When an English learner produces a broken, grammatically incorrect sentence, they're getting a low-quality repetition. But neurologically, a low-quality repetition is infinitely more valuable than 0 repetitions. The imperfection is a mechanical necessity of the learning curve. You can't skip the stumbling phase.
Wait, let me push back on that baby analogy because adults are not babies. A baby has no ego, no established social standing, and no fully developed native language to compare their stumbling against. Adults have all three.
Okay, that is true. I'll give you that.
And that is precisely why the adult language learner experiences the gap between understanding and speaking so acutely. They have the cognitive maturity to understand highly complex English passively, which means they are painfully aware of how far their spoken output falls short of their own intellectual standard.
Right, they hear the gap.
Exactly. To accept low-quality repetitions, as you call them, requires an adult to willingly subject themselves to feeling incompetent. That's a massive psychological hurdle. Messy repetition isn't just a physical calibration. It's a deliberate dismantling of the ego. It's exposure therapy for the fear loop.
But if we treat it purely as exposure therapy, we risk ignoring the rigorous training required for actual fluency. If someone overcomes their fear of speaking but still only practices input, their spoken English will remain permanently broken. They might be confident, but they won't be fluent.
True. Confidence isn't vocabulary.
The mechanical training is the non-negotiable variable here. To think in English requires a deliberate, disciplined effort to bypass the native language. It requires you to look at a dog and force your brain to retrieve the English word without bouncing it off your native tongue first. That is cognitive weightlifting.
Oh, it is exhausting. Yes.
Exactly. The reason people understand but can't speak is that they've spent hundreds of hours reading subtitles, watching videos, and nodding along enjoying what we could call the dopamine hit of comprehension.
The illusion of fluency.
Yes, they feel like they're learning because they understand the video, but they're doing it without ever doing the heavy lifting of production. They are essentially practicing understanding.
I don't disagree that production requires practice. We agree there. But I maintain that the reason they are addicted to the dopamine hit of comprehension, as you perfectly described it, is because comprehension feels safe. Production feels dangerous.
Right.
The gap between understanding and speaking is ultimately sustained by avoidance. When you tell a learner to think in English, the reason they struggle isn't just that it's cognitive weightlifting. It's that thinking in a foreign language strips them of their nuance. It's an intensely uncomfortable psychological state to inhabit.
It is uncomfortable, yes.
Therefore, the moment we stop chasing perfection is the moment we start speaking. The psychological surrender must precede the mechanical repetition. Otherwise, the repetition simply won't happen.
So if we step back from this, I think we actually converge on a really vital point here. We both entirely agree on the core premise established by the material. Understanding is not enough.
Absolutely.
The idea that passive listening will somehow automatically convert into active fluency over time is a complete myth.
Yeah, we both agree that learners are trapped in an illusion of competence. Because they can watch an English video and comprehend it, they mistakenly believe they possess the language.
Right.
But possessing the ability to decode a message is entirely different from possessing the ability to encode one. Passive listening will never magically transform into active fluency without a deliberate, uncomfortable shift in how the learner interacts with the language.
Exactly. From my perspective, that shift has to be a mechanical overhaul of their daily habits. They have to physically train their brains to produce language. They must spend as much time constructing sentences, speaking aloud, and forcing spontaneous synchronous retrieval as they do absorbing passive content.
The daily reps.
The daily reps. The neurological pathways for output, that unpaved trail in the woods, must be built brick by brick through daily, deliberate practice. Without the mechanics, the language simply doesn't exist in a usable form.
And from my perspective, that necessary shift has to begin with dismantling the psychological barriers.
Until a learner stops chasing perfection, the fear loop will continue to block their ability to speak, no matter how much vocabulary they've passively absorbed.
You have to get out of your own way.
You really do. They have to embrace the messiness of imperfect sentences, quiet the internal editor that demands constant translation, and accept that making mistakes isn't a reflection of their intelligence, but a strict requirement of the process. Progress over perfection.
It's clear that language learning is as much about rewiring the physical architecture of the brain as it is about confronting our own internal hurdles.
It really is a deeply complex intersection of cognition and emotion.
Which brings us back to where we started. To the listener out there who can perfectly understand the words we're saying right now, but who freezes when it's time to reply, we leave you to evaluate your own speaking block.
You have to ask yourself, are you simply lacking the mechanical repetitions of output, or is a hidden fear of making mistakes keeping you silent?
The gap is real, but how you choose to bridge it, whether by building the pathway through relentless practice or tearing down the wall of your own overthinking, is a journey you'll have to explore for yourself. Thank you for joining us.